Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Open Source Contributor Conversation. This is a series where we will talk about real people behind open source projects we all rely on and many different paths to contribute. My name is Mila Zhou. Today, we are very honored to have Robert Treat, who is a principal database engineer at AWS and who has been around for PostgreSQL community for over 23 years. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks. Honored to be here.
So 23 years is really a long time. Do you start at 2003?
No, actually, so I started before that, although I don't know when the initial parts are fuzzy a little bit. I started as a user before that. It goes all the way back to the last century. But when I was sort of first started doing contributions, I guess, or whatever, that probably was, well, even that must have been at least 2001. It's sort of funny in the timeline in your head is what other events were going on when you started doing some of this stuff. So you're like, wow. It's like before my second son was born.
Okay, cool. So then you said you started as a user.
Yeah,
And
100%, 100%. Start as a user. And in fact, the my open source journey doesn't even start with Postgres. It starts before that. So if you go way back, even I sort of had what I would call this open source ethos in me, I think. So I was a Windows user. Many people that grew up. So I'm old. So for those warning to those who are
you
out
look
there.
very young.
Maybe. So, well, I'll date myself. So many people, I had Windows 95 on a desktop, so I'm at least that old. You could be sure of that. And then I started using Windows 98, and I was one of those people, and nobody knows what this means anymore, but I would hack my registry, and I was doing all kinds of custom modifications, and I was using IRC even though I was on a Windows machine. So I had this sort of exposure and the things I was trying to do, even back in the Windows environment before I really got into any open source stuff. And some of the first projects that I worked on, I just got involved with the internet and worked on some things collaboratively. On the tech side, probably the main one, I was doing IRC. And so there were a lot of people who had IRC scripts that could do things, maybe like automated downloading of audio files, but obviously I would have never done that. That's a little shady. But other things like trivia quiz scripts and stuff like that. So sharing those scripts I thought was really interesting. And then I also did a fair amount of fantasy sports work back in the day. And so we would share spreadsheets. So this is like we're swapping Excel spreadsheets with macros and stuff like that. And there were just people out there who could write really amazing stuff. And then I could go in and modify it to do what I needed. So all of that, it's sort of the spirit of open source because we're sharing code freely and nobody's worrying about anything and whatnot. Even before I was doing anything that I think people would have called actual open source. So and then the actual open source sort of comes later as my career is kind of moving along and I'm starting to get into web development. And I mean, I was looking at a few different things. Perl was pretty dominant back then, and PHP was just getting started. And PHP was really the thing that locked me into the open source world. And in fact, I don't know if everybody has a here's the moment, like the origin story kind of canon event. In my case, I definitely do have one, which was I was trying to get some PHP code working and I was getting syntax errors back. So I decided to email the mailing list. They had a mailing list. So I emailed the mailing list for help. And it was like I had a syntax error. So somebody was like, oh, that doesn't work like that. You need to use this other syntax. And somebody else replied, like, oh, no, that's not the right syntax. It's actually this thing over here. And then a third person replied, and they're like, no, I think it's the first one, really, but you got to make sure you have this setting, whatever. So, and I looked at all these and I was like, these people are all wrong. I went through and I tried what they did because I was like, maybe I missed something when I was going through it, but they just said all the things that I had tried to troubleshoot. And then the seminal moment is Rasmus Leerdorf, who was the creator of PHP. So he responded to that email thread and he basically said, all three of these people are wrong. Here's what your actual problem is. That was the right answer. Right. And it just blew my mind that, hey, the guy who's created this thing, he's out here answering questions on the mailing list. Right. And like, where are you going to get that kind of access to people who are behind the code and doing stuff? Right. And everything I had ever experienced to that point, PHP was a decent sized project at that point. This is PHP 3 was already out. So that's when it was really taking off. And you're just like, if this is the community and this is what open source is about, then count me in. Like everything I want to work on from now on, I want it to be open source. So it was actually like PHP before I'd ever done any Postgres or any stuff like that. Like PHP and that email from Rasmus was the one. So everything I've done since then, you can blame on Rasmus. That's my sort of origin of like that's when I knew I was locked in.
That sounds like a bumping journey. Like you go through all those wrong answers, and then the
Yeah.
author of the code come out saying, "Okay, here is your solution."
Yeah, I mean, and it totally, I think back on that now, like you reflect on it, and you're like, I guess I could have gone completely the other way, right? If Rasmus doesn't answer that, then like your first experience with open source might be, oh, three guys gave you the wrong answer. So this is why open source doesn't work or whatever, right? Like I can't get it to work. I got three people giving me the wrong answer. And there have been cases in my life where I had a lot of interest in BSD as an operating system early on. So that was, I sort of early in my tech career, didn't have access to a lot of money, so I was always trying to scrape by like whatever I could get, equipment I could get my hands on, and so turned to free operating systems and free software very early on. I was sort of a young parent and all that, so free software was definitely helpful. And I tried to do BSD, but I remember like I had this one old machine that I was trying to get BSD to work on so I could have a running like BSD desktop, and I could not get the kernel to compile. It would overheat the CPU on the machine. There was some issue with the motherboard. And I talked to the guys in the FreeBSD channel on IRC and all that. And those people, I mean, they were very helpful and very friendly, but ultimately it seemed like I had a hardware problem. But the thing that was crazy was that same piece of hardware, like I could get Linux to install on that machine. So like I would have probably gone deeper into BSD, but I couldn't get it to run on the hardware that I had, and I could get Linux to run on the hardware. Then your journey takes a turn that way, right? And I think that's how a lot of these things end up being.
I kind of feel like those are moments you feel like, wow, destiny.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I would certainly say later on I came to use Lumos and Open Solaris and that kind of stuff, and that was really I took a new job. That's what they were using. I got into it and I was like, oh wow, this is really good. And it reminded me of the things I liked about BSD. And it is there's these turning points where you're like, I guess it all made sense. It was kind of funny because Postgres back in those days, I remember one of the first things I was like porting an Access database that Microsoft has. So I was porting a database from Access into Postgres, and the Access database used left joins, and Postgres didn't support left joins back then. So you would get this error message. It was like, sorry, we don't support left joins. We do plan to add it in a future release. That was like the error message that you would get when you try to use it. And at first I was like, oh, if it's not supported in Postgres, it can't be that important. And then you start looking at it and you're like, no, it is important to have left joins. We do need that. So, but I stuck with it. And again, I had open community on the mailing list. They were friendly. They had an IRC channel. I just kind of went down that path further, and it, seems to have worked out for the most part.
What's your first contribution to Postgres?
That's a good question. So this goes back to like when you start with open source, what does that mean? And in my mind, I definitely started as a user because I was on IRC and the mailing list didn't quite have the volume back then that they have now. So the first sort of real contributions that I think I was making, and it was mostly just a learning process for myself, was just answering other people's questions, right? Once you were on IRC long enough, or like today, if you were on Slack or something, you'd see enough questions would come by, you would actually understand how to answer people's questions that they are asking because they're asking the questions that you were asking 3 months ago or whatever. So that was a cycle starts where you're like, I can be one of these people. And my goal is let me be the person who is not giving the three wrong answers. I want to be the person who's giving the correct answer to save people trouble and hopefully help them with their experience. So that was where it got started. On the coding side, that really came much later. And I was doing, I went through a couple of jobs, but I ended up at a place where I was doing PHP development and I was using PHP PG admin, and I had preferred that over the regular PG admin. I remember I wanted something where I could edit functions, and like again, PSQL didn't have this functionality yet, and I don't know, maybe PG admin had it or maybe it didn't, but I wanted something I could edit functions and do create or replace function in a sort of desktop tool. And it was like I knew PHP, and I had this thing in front of me, right? And somebody was just like, I'm sitting there typing it up. Here's all the things it needs to do, and here's how it needs to work, or whatever. And somebody, just mentioned to me, like, you could just write that feature yourself. Like, all this stuff. You know how Postgres works, system catalogs, like, the coding language. Why don't you just write the feature yourself? And I thought about it. I was like, I think it would actually be faster for me to just write this myself than I'll try to explain someone and go back and forth and whatever. And so that was the first big contribution. was like putting that function editing capability in there and submitting that back. And, again, like from there, it kind of went on. There were other things along the way. And I've definitely been one who, uh, I mean, I had sort of this model. I used to say it was a Gandhi-esque thing, but it was really like just looking like where does the project need help and what are the tools that you see are popular and maybe they need someone to go work on that. You hear a lot of Postgres folks talk about how we're always looking for contributors, but what I have found is that like people who really know C code very well, we've never not had enough of those, right? There are definitely other parts of the project that were very glaring that they needed more help. So, like another example would be like I was on the web infrastructure team early on with Postgres, right? And I was doing like admin type work for like mailing lists and things like that, helping run all that web infrastructure that Postgres had because Postgres needed that. Like we just didn't have everyone who was doing that was somebody who also was like a C hacker. So, or some like they had another thing that was their main gig. And the real way they could, the real way they were contributing to Postgres. And it was like, but we also have a website. We know we need people to work on that. And we know we need a better documentation. We needed, like, we had a wiki back then. We needed that to get updated. So it was like, well, I can do all these things. And I see that other people aren't, or I think it's better served that I do that than have somebody else do it, right? Who might be deep in the internals already or something like that. So
I think it's a perfect time to talk about do you think we're at a good shape for website documentation, or is actually a time for us to call for volunteers?
you're always kind of looking for some level of pipeline. So I think the call for volunteers, I mean, there are certain things right now, like I would say one of the things we really could use, I think, is we need people who like are willing to run meetups, right? If you look, especially in the United States, we have basically two in-person meetups that I think meet semi-regularly, which is the one in New York that I know you're involved with, and then there's one in Chicago, and then there's an online one. I guess there's two online ones that are like virtual ones, but if you think about it in like some of these larger cities, it's a little surprising to me in the San Francisco Bay Area, San Jose, anywhere in that region, they used to have strong in-person meetups and they don't do them anymore. And I sort of feel like it's surprising that we don't have meetups in that area for Postgres. And they do a virtual one. The group that used to do the in-person one, they do a virtual one. And maybe I'm wrong and the market has just changed and people aren't interested in meetups, but I sort of feel like, nah, I think people still are interested in meetups, right? We need more ways to do in-person connection, I think, as people than we needed in the past. So that's the kind of thing where it's like it really takes barely even any Postgres knowledge like to get that started. But it is a lot of work, right? It's a commitment of time and effort for sure. So that's the kind of thing where you always need more volunteers, like, and then you can find work for them to do. And if you can review code, that is fantastic. There are definitely patches that come along that I get involved with because it's an area that I'm either like really familiar with, which usually means I've had a lot of pain dealing with that problem in the past, or I just find it to be an interesting area of code to deal with. I get involved in that somewhat. Um, but again, also it depends on where you're at in life. Like this year, I've been doing a lot of travel, so like that makes it really difficult to kind of stay sort of up to speed on a patch as it's sort of working its way through Postgres land. So you find like smaller things that like doc patches are usually a good one, but I think we have a lot of people who review that stuff. But again, like just people asking questions is actually useful. If you're not sure where to get started, just start as a user and ask questions that you need help with and try to answer other people's questions. Like that makes you a part of the community. And that's
Yeah.
really the first thing. Don't worry about contributing. Like just like move into the neighborhood before you worry about trying to figure out how to make the neighborhood better. Like, live there and experience it a little bit. Then you can figure those things out.
I think that definitely connects with something actually I wanted to ask later. This series we really want to talk to a lot of students or beginners who are thinking about, yeah, how can I contribute to open source, especially to mature project like PostgreSQL. And you mentioned don't think about contribute right away, but really just be a user, being there, like observe, answer questions, and ask questions first and answer questions. That also very connected to your experience. You have been in like fundraising, sponsorship, organizing events, meetups, all those different roles instead of just a coder. You also mentioned a lot of open source projects you have been a part of. So what hook you around in PostgreSQL?
I think probably on some level, because of the early experiences really around the web work and doing some of that stuff in a time when, like DBAs typically don't do web work and C coders don't do web work, right? You're pretty far away from that. So that sort of got me like on this parallel path of like, here, how can I best serve the project and keeping that idea in mind, regardless of what I'm doing in my day to day. And that does eventually become working with contracts and stuff because nobody really likes to work with contracts. So then it's like, okay, I have to deal with contracts in my day to day. Like I'll just use those skills to help the Postgres project, right? That's kind of how that has gone around. And then I would also say that there was other open source that I was interested in. And I would say that once you are understand as a general rule, like how does open source work and do you have the skills to improve your own situation? And again, that does go back to if you're a user of the thing and you have the ability to modify the thing, there's no reason that has to be any one particular project. So for me, like most of the stuff that I dealt with was probably, database related. A lot of it was like Postgres utilities and extensions and stuff like that. Especially in the Postgres world, again, like we have all these extensions and other tools that are out there. So you can get involved in things and you don't have to, be studying B tree index plans or whatever. It's a big world out there. There were certain projects that I used where like I saw it ran on like MySQL and I was like, how do I get this? I want to port this to Postgres, right? And use it with Postgres. So there were projects like that that I got involved with. I at times, and I would say for most of my career, Postgres was a part of my day job as well as the thing that I was working on. Even if those two things weren't necessarily aligned, specifically, there were definitely jobs I had where like we were using Postgres and there was no expectation or maybe even a non-expectation of contributing back to the Postgres community and whatnot. So I would do that myself anyways because I thought it was interesting and kind of that was my hobby at times. So that's why I would get involved in some of that stuff. But again, like as you just sort of see, especially when it comes to helping other open source projects and other communities, I spent a good portion of my time doing operations work in my career when DevOps was becoming a thing. The first time I got involved in a lot of DevOps related work, and some of that was conference organizing, and some of that was talking about open source and where that can help with those kinds of tools that were coming out. And then again, there was a lot of overlap in some of those communities, like the chef community. I knew a lot of people in that community. Some of that was the initial folks that I knew were people I knew from other open source communities. Yeah. So like those communities can overlap and branch out. And that happens, it's sort of, I guess it's unfortunate because sometimes we see people go from the Postgres community into some other community and they become big working on that other thing. And you're like, oh, I wish they would have stayed in Postgres. But for them, like the other thing becomes more interesting. And so they go work on that.
Yeah. Well, like here is something actually I learned new recently that you have been a CEO, you have been running a company, you have been going through a acquisition and all those experiences. You were actually one of the C-suite before. Now you are a principal engineer. So what drew you back to the hands-on work?
This is the Postgres community is it's hard to get rid of. I had started this company on ETI. We were like scalability consultants, and I started there as the first DBA on staff. And that was sort of I was using Postgres a lot. I was very involved in the community at that point, and just sort of looking for bigger challenges. And so I took the job there, and it's sort of interesting. Like I had the technical stuff that I was working on and writing code and dealing with all that stuff, but I also saw the bigger picture because I had done advocacy work related to the Postgres community. So you could see how these two things crossed. And oddly enough, I had studied a fair amount of business early on in my schooling that I never thought I would put to use, but it did come in handy. So those sort of pieces all fit together. And I guess, as I say, like I worked my way up in the company. And eventually, the person who was the founder of the company and CEO, he went to do a startup. And so I had been working as his COO at that point for, I think, like 2 or 3 years. And then so I took over as CEO for about 4 years, and then they sold the company, and there was like this series of acquisitions, and so I got out of stuff, and then I was like, I don't know what I want to do next, but this goes back to like the Postgres thing. Like when it wasn't a job, it was a hobby, right? Like I still found Databases, I think, are just interesting pieces of software. Distributed systems, I find to be very interesting, like mental puzzles to wrap your head around. So I was still doing occasional events for Postgres, and I would run like Postgres community booths on the side. And then there was a portion, honestly, seeing what Amazon had done and how they had sort of changed and grown what they were doing, especially in their relationship with the Postgres community. I knew some of the folks who were on the Postgres contributor team, which is the team I'm on now. And so just kept the lines of communication open with them. And eventually it was like, hey, I think I want to actually do full time Postgres stuff again. It was funny because I sort of explored AI because I thought like maybe the next chapter is going to be I'll go down this AI rabbit hole and that'll be like the super interesting thing. And I looked at it and there was stuff that was interesting there, but it wasn't like, I don't know, it didn't feel the passion of it, right? Like I guess that I still have with the Postgres community. Yeah. So eventually just ended up contacting Joe, who is the guy who runs our team now, and said, hey, if you guys are still hiring, like I'm interested. I think I'm ready to do full-time Postgres again. So
Amazing. Yeah. But then, like, just think about all those moments. What's the moment you are most proud of?
yeah, this is a really tricky kind of question. People ask me about that stuff. So I would tell you it's the small moments. So I'm not a big tout my accomplishments person or whatever. It's probably more the little moments. Every now and then somebody will write me an email. I'm really bad about this because I generally don't respond because I just have no idea what to say. So I've gotten these where they're like, hey, you did this thing, and it'll usually be like 10 years ago. Like 10 years ago, you sent this patch in for this open source project, right? Or you like wrote this thing, or you answered this question for me. And because of that, like I thought this was amazing and I want to get into open source. And now like I've been doing open source for a decade now or whatever. Those are the things where you're just like, I mean, it's hard not to smile when you get that kind of thanks. And so I don't know if that's like a pride thing or whatever, but it is those are like those little moments to me that over the course of the career, you're like, well, maybe I am doing the right thing, like I've had a positive impact on somebody. And that's to me, that's the thing you're hoping that at the end of the day, you end up having a positive impact for folks. So
Definitely. I think there is a lot of those small moments in open source that makes us feel like we are connected with people and we're really making a positive impact on someone. That's
yeah.
just unbelievable. We had this conversation last time. You also mentioned AI earlier. Then will AI kill PostgreSQL?
I definitely don't think so, but that doesn't mean it won't have a dramatic change on it. But I would also say this project has gone through these dramatic changes before. Certainly, anyone who knows the history of Postgres, I mean, the history of Postgres is like it's kind of amazing that Postgres is here, let alone that people work on it and you know companies that use it and whatnot. For those that don't know, like the super brief history, it was originated way back at Berkeley as a sort of research project that essentially was abandoned. Occasionally, some of the students would hack on it and try to prove some doctoral thesis or whatever. But it was essentially an abandoned project from the university perspective. And again, picked up by open source developers who started, making patches on it. And eventually they got a little more organized. And we've gone through these ways where the change in the project and how things operate and who's involved there were times when you did wonder the number of commercial entities that were involved in Postgres was so small. We would often look at other open source projects that had far more success than Postgres, and many of them were driven by companies. And you would look at that and say, I think if only we had a company that was driving Postgres' success, like that would make this so much easier, it'd be so much better. And then you just always seem to see the long term of that sort of corporate owned open source thing, right? I have this phrase where it's open source product versus open source project, and so most of those things tended to be open source products. And no matter how great the founder was and how well intentioned they are and how altruistic they are with open source and whatever they say they want to do, like at the end of the day, chances are they have signed legal documents that mean they can be booted from the company at some point, and you see that sad story happen. And so with this thing, like it's a project, it's co-owned by the people who are involved and the people who are working on it. And we entered this age of sort of quote unquote the hyperscalers. Now everybody has a Postgres. There was this old joke that it was like when you see like Microsoft running Postgres, then like you'll know that we've actually won the battle or something. And it was like not only does Microsoft have a Postgres, like Oracle runs Postgres in their system, right? So you're just like everybody has a Postgres system, and I think that's good. How's AI going to change that? I think it's actually going to push it even further. There are definitely projects, especially with database software. If you want to make like a deep fundamental change to something like Postgres, I think it still is a lot of work. It used to be an order of magnitude more work. But now we talk to companies who have actually gone through and they have database engineers and they use AI and they're like, yeah, we have a fork of Postgres we're running internally because we needed to make this change, which was pretty fundamental to what Postgres is doing. And we would see this occasionally over the years because there were companies like Greenplum is one, Aster Database. I mean, there's been a bunch that took Postgres, forked it, made changes, tried to make that into a product. I think you get into what I feel is like this Linux kernelization thing, where there's all these companies that have different versions of the Linux kernel, and then you have an upstream that sort of keeps everybody working together. I feel like that's what Postgres is probably going to look like in the next few years. That like there'll be a lot more Postgres forks that are out there, but I still think you'll have the upstream project keeping everybody at least sort of on the same track, hopefully. So, and then I don't, 10 years from now, though, I think it's anyone's guess as to what not only Postgres but the world is going to look like. I can be sure there will still be people running Postgres 10 years from now, unless there's some magic thing that we come up with. And there's been so many different solutions that people have thought were going to knock relational model out of the game, and it's still there. So I think there's enough fundamentals of that. There will be Postgres, and we know there's still people running databases that were installed, a decade ago and 20 years ago, and there's still VAX IMS machines out there and like just really old stuff like that just never goes away. So there'll be some Postgres still running out there a decade from now, I'm sure. But maybe it'll
Yeah.
all be robots doing it all instead of people. So that is hard to say.
How is it going to affect the community?
That's a real good question. I think that's a question that's bigger than Postgres, right? If you have AI that's doing all this stuff for you, then I think, again, like it's sort of this weird thing where the more that you can automate that stuff, it's almost like the more the in person communication and meeting and getting to know people becomes almost more important because you need to find common ground, right? If you decide, hey, we do need to have a central code base that everybody works from and again keeps people on track. The people who are still interested in that, they have to figure out how do we find common ground, especially in a world where it's not interaction. Some of these patches, you watch the folks who work on them, and like somebody will send a patch and then somebody else will review it and then she gives feedback to the first person and it just it goes round and round. For some of these are for years, these patches are worked on, and those people, they develop a relationship over the patch work over time. If AI is doing all that, then presumably you don't have those years long patch interactions, but you still can get together and you still can meet with people, and hopefully that'll go on. I do think we'll have to figure out again how to get new contributors. I think that's a thing people worry about. But just like making again, I think this is any piece of software. The language you're in, people are worried they don't teach you enough C code anymore. But it's yeah, but the AI can teach you how to write C code, right? So I don't worry about that part too much. My C code is definitely better if I have an AI looking at it. That may not be true of everybody. There's a lot of people who write really good C code in Postgres, but I think like we can upskill people on that, and we don't need to worry about that part so much. But it will be like, are you going to actually still get together, right? You're still going to have conferences to discuss what you're working on and share those ideas. Those ideas become, I think, a more important piece of the picture. So
I know that in many projects that's writing in C, there are also initiatives that replace them with Rust. Are there any similar projects within PostgreSQL, like writing features in pieces with Rust instead of C?
I think the sort of real official answer as far as like what is the community going to do and what's the community think about this, the answer to that would basically be no. There is a project, PGRX, which allows you to write stored procedures and modules for Postgres in Rust, and it can interface with C. So there is a community of those folks that are out there, and I will tell you, like there are some sort of uh, I don't know, semi-random people out there in the world who have basically gone to the AI and said, rewrite the Postgres code into Rust. And there are folks who at least claim to have, 100% working compliant copies of Rust-based Postgres. Um, but I think, the level of sort of tuning and experience people have and what that like see for that sort of low level type stuff, which Postgres, fits into that, like it's pretty hard to beat. And again, like all the AIs know how to write C code. That's usually, I think, again, I think the concern that people won't know how to write it or they need to do Rust. I think you're going to have more people wanting to do Postgres than ever. I mean, like it's a little bit of a version of the Javon's paradox that people talk about with AI, right? You make it cheaper, then it actually gets used more instead of less. And I think in this case, like you're making the access easier, right? If more people could actually write Postgres extensions, which will be true with AI, right? Objectively, more people will be able to write Postgres extensions because the AI can do the work of what the extension needs to get done. Do you think we'll have fewer extensions or more extensions? We'll have more of them, right? Like that. So, and
Sure.
then, so what do we need the volunteer to do? We need the volunteers to curate those extensions, right? We have several projects like that have sprung up over the last few years, and none of them have stuck. So, like, there's still going to be a place for volunteers, like trying to figure out like which are the good ones, right, and which ones are widely used, and sort of figuring out those statistics and whatnot. So there'll be projects around that stuff that'll go. But I think you're going to have more people who want to contribute, and then I think this is the part where the like 5 year, 10 year thing becomes really difficult because like in a world where AI writes 90% of the code, right now we have this real concern over code quality. And this is not a new, actually that's also one of the things, most of the arguments we have in computer science in this industry, I feel like none of these are actually new arguments, right? They're like just amplified with different emphasis on one side or the other. So like this idea of like quality code versus code that works. Like we have been having that debate for a long time, certainly 20 years or more in technology in general. When we were doing scalability consulting, they had this thing good, fast, or cheap, like you can only pick two. And so we had people in our company that were like, oh no, we need, great abstractions and it's got a, beautiful, elegant code and we want it to be very reusable. And then we had other folks on the other side are like, I just need it to effing work, basically, right? Like if it runs and does what it's supposed to do, that's good enough. We'll figure out how to clean it up or fix it later. And so those sides have always been going back and forth. If the AI is writing all the code, like I can see, I don't know that it will go this way, but I can envision at least the idea that like, why do you care about the code quality? It's the AI who's got to deal with that mess, right? And also the idea that like maybe you throw away way more code than you used to. Like that idea that like you want to write a prototype and have it be flexible enough so that you can evolve it over, years of time and as your workload changes and your mission changes, like, okay, maybe that's the way you would do it. But I think in an AI world, who's to say that a lot of that code where you're like, man, that was never meant to run in production. It's like, okay, well, we don't have to spend a year rewriting this thing. We can spend, 2 weeks or a month or something rewriting this now that we actually know what it really needs to do. So I think like the software industry I suspect is going to change dramatically. Postgres obviously is going to feel that, it'll have to adapt to that, but I don't know that anybody really knows what that's going to look like, 5 years from now. So
Are there any experiments that you are doing yourself to prepare yourself for the changes?
I try to play with all the tools on some level. I use Kiro, right? Because I'm in Amazon, so I get pretty good, I can get easy access to that and people who know how to use it. So that's really nice. But I use different models. I started with OpenAI, probably like a lot of people when the first like, ChatGPT came out there a few years ago. And it was like, oh, like this AI is actually a thing. Like, I mean, I've heard people talk about AI for a long time, right? And then I think like ChatGPT for so many people, me included, was like, oh, we have to start paying attention now because this is actually useful and this can actually do something. So I do all of those things, things like OpenClaw and whatnot. I don't know that everybody has to go in that deep on it, but I'm at least like trying to pay attention to all of them and sort of understand how to work with them, how to do the agent stuff, and make agents and different things. Even amongst, I've talked to other Amazonians because again, like we're lucky that within Amazon, we have a lot of support from leadership and we have access to a lot of tools. So we can use Claude if we want to. And, we have Amazon Q and like just all the Enkiro. And so we have a bunch of different things to work with. So probably this is how I've always sort of operated in the past is I'm more of a, wide breadth kind of person. And then my theory is like when you really need to dive deep on something, like at that moment, like you can probably go learn it. And I'm sort of betting that the AI can help me learn it when I need to go deep on a specific thing. Um, but understanding like how do you make agents in like, Kiro versus how do you make them in Claude or something like that. Like I want to at least have that idea there so that I'm ready to move in whichever direction I need to and having it look at code and ask it questions. And again, it's just like be open to embracing it. I'm a normally sort of paranoid guy on some level when it comes to technology and privacy and those kinds of issues. And so that's been a hard hurdle to get past with some of this stuff. But it is like, okay, so figure out where does it make sense that I can use this and I don't expose things to everything. And also understanding like, like Gemini, I really like the Gemini models. I think are very good, but they're kind of bad for privacy if you care about that stuff. So um, figuring out what trade-offs are important to you and then going in on the models that will work for those trade-offs. I should give a shout out to Duck AI, DUCK.ai, which is from the folks that make DuckDuckGo, because they are the sort of best sort of privacy folks out there, I think, for sort of mass consumer technology stuff like the browser and AI stuff. So they have an AI thing. I use that. Probably use that the most because then I don't have to worry as much about what I'm actually telling the AI and what data I'm giving it or whatever. So at least for personal stuff, but yeah, be open to that stuff. I think embrace it. Like figure out what are the ways you can use it, because it's not going to stop. I know there's some people who would like to stop it, would like to slow it down. I'm like that it's not going to happen. It's too useful. Even if it's not like not everybody becomes a 10x engineer, right? Don't if you're feeling like that thing where you're like, oh my gosh, like AI is taking everybody's jobs and there's people who are using it and I'm never going to figure it out and all that stuff. Like I would say don't have those concerns, be open, use it for what you can use it. Uh, I would say look into the agent stuff because I think that is pretty powerful stuff. Um, that's probably enough to keep you moving in the right direction. And at this point in time, like that's really, I think, the main goal that most people should have.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I also have been going through the struggle of yeah, I need to start to learn more about AI, but there are too many things to try. But really, just get your hands on, try a few of them, and then you get an idea of how it works. And I also found that learning from others, sit together with someone who show you
Yeah.
how they use AI, that helps a lot.
Even just listening. So I recently went to sort of an informal meetup at one of the nearby Amazon offices. And I think if your office hasn't done this, like, or whatever community you're in, you should try to, so I've done it there where we went and it was just people talking about how are you using AI and whatever that was. And it was like one person was using it on their baseball card collection, another lady had planned her wedding and was doing stuff like that, for where she was going to go on her honeymoon and figuring out how to do invitations and all that stuff. So she was using it for all that kind of stuff. So like, okay, that's pretty interesting. And then a friend of ours runs a sushi meetup in Tampa where I live. And so we went to that and there were people there who were talking about AI. And so you're getting people from all these different backgrounds, right? And that to me, like that's the sort of really nice thing. If you're like confused as to what it's useful for, just go talk to people, find people who are using it and just say, hey, is anybody using AI in whatever the community is that you're in? It doesn't really matter. And there'll be one or two people, and then you just ask them like, oh, what are you using it for? And they'll start to give you ideas that might be useful for you, or you'll see like, oh, you use it for that. I need it for this other thing that's pretty similar. Like I should look into that and get started, right? Like go become a user. So
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. It's really in the community, sharing knowledge definitely helps a lot.
yeah, and I think people will be surprised as to who is using this stuff, right? I mean, it's easy if you work in tech. Like, so on my team, all the people are at least looking at it. Like, it's different levels of who's using it, but like, we're all coders, right? We know technology and whatnot. So, like, yeah, obviously, we're all going to have some ideas about it. What's more interesting to me is actually the things like when you go to the sushi thing, and it's people from all different backgrounds, like people who are not in tech, right? And they're using it for stuff, and they're telling you, and it's stuff that like I hadn't thought of, like, oh, that is a good idea. I should use something for that. Or like, oh, that would be more useful than what I'm doing. So that I think any community that's out there, probably somebody is looking at it and somebody's using it to make improvements to what they're doing. Start asking questions and don't feel bad about that.
I love the open mind that you carry. You're not okay, I'm in tech, probably I know more than others, but you really try to find the inspiration everywhere from every conversation. So we are at time. It was super helpful conversation. Any last word do you have for people listening to this conversation, want to get maybe participating open source in PostgreSQL?
I think from an open source perspective, I always tell people just go get into the community first, get started, start reading stuff, find things that you are using. If Postgres is one of those things that you think you'd want to use, Again, like there's a lot of different ways to get involved with Postgres, like go to a local meetup if there is one, go to a virtual meetup if there isn't. There are still mailing lists. There are Slack. There's a Slack team that I'm on that's community Slack team. There are Discords out there for Postgres. So there's lots of different ways to get involved. Like just getting into that space is probably the first way. If you want to contribute, again, there are lots of tools around Postgres. There's lots of extensions. I think the sort of barrier is lower with those things in that it's not so intimidating. You don't have to wade through, like 100 emails a day or whatever, where the like really heavy sort of hackers folks are. But if you're like a C coder and you want to get involved and that's what you want to do, like that's also awesome. There's ways to do that. Probably go to one of those other things first and ask people like, hey, what's a good way for me to get involved? But it will probably be something like look at the commit fest, find some patches that look interesting to you, start reviewing patches. That's actually the thing that's usually the most useful is for people to start reviewing patches and testing them and looking for issues and trying to understand like how these pieces fit together. But don't be intimidated. Like I understand it is intimidating, right? And it can definitely be scary to like get out there in public and do work in public. But I think most people, it's kind of like speaking at conferences. I always tell people like when you go up there, like people want you to succeed. Like you may not feel that that's the crowd wants you to succeed, but it's the same in open source, right? Like the other people who are writing this code and looking at these patches, they want you to be able to be helpful. So they're ultimately they're hoping for your success as well. So don't be that intimidated about it. You probably can find a way to contribute.
Definitely. We have talked about method, but like, what's the motivation? Like for people who are hesitating or thinking about if I should be a part of the community or the project, what's your word?
So for me, it's I stick with Postgres because I find it interesting. I think the technology is interesting in a way that like it's sort of funny because it's not just that it's complicated enough, but not boring. Like I kind of don't find LLMs super interesting, but I find database like the relational model I find very interesting, and there's a lot of material to read on it and study. Um, that isn't it for everybody, right? So like you do have to find your why, as they say, like that phrase that's out there. On a career level, it certainly can be useful. Open source is kind of the ultimate networking tool now in the day and age that we live in. So when you think about what your career you might want to do or things you, whether it's database specifically or just like, here's a company, they happen to use Postgres because a lot of companies use Postgres, like that might be an avenue for future career things. Amazon is hiring. I guess I should mention that. We have a lot of jobs in the database ecosystem that Amazon has. So, if you're looking for a job in databases, open source participation definitely helps get through the noise. I think there can be a lot of different reasons people are motivated. For me, again, like it was sort of the hobby that became work that became a hobby that went through cycles of hobby and work for me. So, because I thought it was interesting technology. But whatever your reason, I think you can be motivated for different reasons and still get involved and still move forward.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you, Robert. Really appreciate your time and your sharing. Honestly, if there's one thing that I can take away from our conversation, I really appreciate the open mind you have and the willing heart to share and to help. You are looking for places that need help. You're looking for ways that can meaningfully contribute and help the community. I think for open source, that's what makes the community amazing. That's what lifts the community up. And that's also why you don't need to be the best coder to have a seat in open source community, because we need people who host meetups. We need designers, we need organizers, we need mentors to make the community successful. So if anyone, you are like wondering how you can participate, how you can contribute, definitely just find a project, find a small thing that you can start from, and the community will welcome you. So thank you, Robert, and we're looking forward to see you next time.
All righty. Thank you.